Welcome to the Checking In podcast from the Great Lakes MHTTC, a series discussing topics related to health equity and the destigmatization of substance use disorder and mental illness.
This is our Checking In podcast, and I'm interviewing Marco Torrez-Miranda. And thank you for joining us today, Marco.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm excited to share a little bit about the work I've done, but thank you.
Yes. So let's go right into it, and can you tell us about the work that you do in the trauma-informed arena?
Yeah. So I started doing psychotherapy probably about close to 20 years ago now. It's been a while, and my initial focus was because I'm Spanish speaking, I'm bilingual, was really trying to better connect with my community, right? My Spanish speaking community in Madison, which is where I started doing my practice. And in connecting with the community, a lot of what I learned was the impact of um, how racialized systems really affect their ability to thrive, to belong, just to be in communities that they were not a part of. And so that was sort of in the back end of my mind, really better understanding the impact of systems and how systems have an impact on how we see ourselves and how, depending on the systems that we're a part of, they could be traumatizing. I didn't get to that sort of awareness later because much of my initial work, right, was sort of really just honing in on my therapeutic skills, but really in time specializing in simple and complex trauma. And so I started to work a lot with people that had been through very severe accidents, attempted murders, sort of these isolated events, up to working with people that had lived with trauma since their childhood and had experienced multiple traumatic incidents throughout their lifetime. And so as I honed into that skill, I started to make the connections of the types of symptoms that would present from simple, complex, and what I would call racialized trauma, and the similarities that they have around how we um, see ourselves, how we function with other people, and the coping skills. Sometimes, the maladaptive coping skills that come from that. And so, how do you use some of the education, the knowledge that I sort of had learned through my training to impact reducing the stress that comes along with some of those factors?
You had mentioned racialized systems. Can you say more about racialized systems?
Yeah. And so, for example, when you live in a place like Madison, which is very white, there's pockets of communities of color. There is a noticeable difference when a person of color enters a space and the perception that they may have of you, but sort of how they treat you. And especially in my practice of working with a lot of people that were monolingual Spanish speakers, and being in spaces where not even the way they spoke or the way they knew how to express themselves was understood or accepted, and the level of exclusion and sometimes the impact of that in that dehumanization of how people then no longer see themselves as worthy or valid, right? And how that can lead to so many other things just based on your race or your racial, what people perceive your race to be. And what was really struck to me when I started to notice this much more evidently was in working with a lot of the men that I worked with that had come to me because of um, driving under the influence, like DUI, OWI charges. And the more that we would dive into sort of their patterns of drinking or substance use, and they would bring up, right, these topics of how at work they were not valued, and how they were oftentimes um, scapegoated, or in a way treated as not human, led them to bottle up these feelings, go home, drink excessively to forget that stuff, in addition to the stuff they had gone through to come to this country. And so, to me, that relationship, right, of how the ways that we are treated, and sometimes based on our racial background, can really impact the way that then I start to function, and how, right, that is in itself a mental health issue, is the dysfunction that these influences have on how I see myself and am able to engage with others.
What makes your work really interesting is that you do this work as a micro specialist working with individuals and families in therapy, but you also do this as a macro specialist with like systems and and you teach in these areas as well. So can you say more about that?
Definitely. So my current role, I've paused my practice right now and really focused my energy working at a higher ed institution, a 2-year technical college in Madison. And my work has focused on how do we change the practices of educators to be more responsive to students from diverse backgrounds. Specifically, the charge that sort of my unit was given was to focus on racial inequities with our student outcomes. And so, knowing that we're a predominantly white institution, meaning that most of our faculty are white identifying, there's a level of awareness that has to be built around the impact of behaviors in the classroom, especially when working with students that have maybe minoritized based on their racial ethnic background. And in that work, I discovered a lot of interesting nuances of how the programming that we're all in, the socialization that we all go through, and depending on sort of where we are socialized, when people start to push back on that, the impact that has in activating a part of our brain that leads us to just shut down and not be engaged to the conversation, not being engaged to learning different skills or being more reflective and self-critical, I would say, in how I've been handling my classroom or the content that I teach or how I engage with other colleagues. And so that's been my work right now is focused on how do we build structures and systems to be able to impact faculty specifically within academic affairs. So our institution has a total of 9 academic schools. And so how do we build an institutional framework where people can engage in different levels of this work, knowing that people are in different spaces around diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Some very new to this, others a bit more versed just based on their educational or personal background.
So, given that both your clinical work and working with clients with traumatic experiences, and then your academic work in the classroom, how do you that makes anyone like who does the work that you do vulnerable to secondary trauma, secondary PTSD, burnout? So, we want to know, how do you take care of yourself to guard against those occupational hazards of burnout and secondary PTSD while doing this important work?
Yeah, great question, Mark. I'll share a little story before I get to sort of what I do. When I initially graduated with my bachelor's, I was a community social worker, and I worked a lot with people that were homeless, a lot with people that were newly diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. And I would personalize a lot of that work to a point that after a year of doing that intensive work, I quit my job because I just could not take it, right? I was not sleeping, I wasn't eating, I had lost so much weight and the rumination, just not being able to stop the inabilities, my inabilities of how I could not help people just based on structures that were beyond me. And that was really a huge moment for me. And I bring that up because I really often reflect on that time and what I did not do to be able to be prepared for the marathon that this requires you to be in, right? It's not a race. It's really thinking more long-term wise. First thing I started to really focus on was just taking care of my physical health, making sure that I have a good routine with how I sleep, what I eat. I eat pretty healthy in the sense that I have like an 80-20 rule. 80% of the time I eat really healthy, clean food, protein, veggies, and 20% of my time is like, hey, pizza, hot dog, whatever, like
It's like a good formula.
yeah. And then making sure I'm staying active. For me, I'm a naturally anxious person because of my own history of trauma. And so I know that I'm already like programmed to be overtly sort of on the edge of things. And so when I don't attend to my body, and specifically when I don't do exercise that activates my system to get those chemicals going to reduce my anxiety threshold, I know it's going to not end up well. And so for me, it's eating healthy, taking care of my body, also staying active. And the beauty of me staying active is I really enjoy running, and running has been such a skill building for me around recognizing the importance of how I hold my breath, and how the breath is so critical to either inadvertently activating my system or having enough control of my breath where I can really reduce my heart rate, my muscle tension, and allow myself, my mind, and my body to relax. And
That's
so
very interesting.
all those things are like really critical. And I'll say like it's been sort of this ongoing process of learning, right? Like first body was really important to me because of that year where I quit and I couldn't function well. but then also through all the training and experience with trauma therapy and learning about the neuroscience of the brain, and the connection that it all has right around your gut health and how that impacts your mental health and your physical health, your breathing. Um, I really try to put a lot of what I talk about in therapy into practice into my own life. And from that, have developed my own sort of mechanisms to be able to ensure that I'm attending to my own wellness. Um,
Nice.
the other important thing that I always talk about is because in therapy, our work is so confidential, right? We can't go home and talk about what happened at an
Mhm.
appointment today because there's, HIPAA and there's privacy practices that ethically, right, we have to uphold. We're finding a great community of practice, if you will, right? Colleagues within my agency organization that I can turn to, that I can talk about this stuff in detail if I want to, while also having a really supportive system at home where I come home and I had a really crappy day or I'm triggered by something that brought something up for me and I can't let it go. Where my partner or my friends that are close to me will be able to give me that support based on what I need without diving too deep into the details of what is actually happening, right? Because they understand that I have that ethical obligation to maintain. So it's really turning to me, but also having people I can turn to for different needs based on the context of what I might need to process or need to talk about, or just need to be in a space where someone's there with me while I sit in my feelings or process the stuff that may be coming up for me internally without the necessary piece of having to talk about it in detail.
And what are the biggest threats to your self care as a trauma specialist, and how do you guard against those threats?
Yeah. I think for me, well, I know it has been knowing my trigger points around particular topics that might bring up things that I just can't shake. Early on, I had to really set some very clear guidelines with my supervisor to say, I can't take on these specific cases because I'm still healing from some of this stuff.
Wow.
And for me, that all comes back to having really good self awareness, right?
Yes.
Knowing myself, knowing what may impact my own anxiety, trauma, and being able to be open about sharing that with someone so that they can better coach and support sort of those pieces around what I'm able to take on. The more that I've done this work, the less that's become an issue.
Okay.
Especially early on, I had to be really clear about what I was able to take on as I went through my own process of making sure I was healthy of mind and body, if you will, to be able to do some of the work that I was ready for at some point in time. And so um, the other part that I think is really challenging for me is um, by nature, I'm kind of like a problem fixer, or I was a problem fixer. And being impatient is a huge sort of challenge for me. I have to really check my lack of patience and tell myself that this is a process, and give myself and the person I'm working with the grace that this is a long haul journey sometimes that has some really great highs and lows, but that it's not going to be a quick fix. And in fact, if it's a
Yes.
quick fix, let's check ourselves because clearly, right, those things might just be very in the moment and not long lasting for the
You
time.
called it a marathon earlier. So some people who help others for a living, they have this invisible sign in the middle of their forehead that reads, I'll help anybody anytime, just call me. And
Mhm.
people will call sometime at the wrong time. You're watching the finale of American Idol and they call. They have a problem for you to solve. So there's a time that we have at home where we're replenishing ourselves, right? And but there are people who always want help. They may not even be our clients. How do
Mhm.
you set those boundaries?
Mm-mm. Great question. Um, that's hard, right? Because I think I'm a person too that for whatever reason, I think there's personalities when I meet someone, they like unload their life on me. I never asked anything but how are you? They told me like their whole life story,
Right.
which I appreciate it. I think it's a gift that I have. Um, I tell myself often that I can't be everything to everybody. And
So
I
it's
have
self-talk. You tell yourself, I can't be everything to everyone. You remind yourself of that. Mhm.
yeah. Because and this is again why I told that sort of story when I was my first year after undergrad, doing community social work. Because I know when I tried to do that, I couldn't do it. I know physically, mentally, I was not capable, and I don't ever think I want to be everything to everybody. Like I have to check my ego, And I have to let myself know that I have a role in particular spaces, but I also need to be able to take on different roles in other spaces
Right.
because I am not that powerful, that all knowing, that, that full of resources that I can just let things just continue to go. Um, it gets hard though, Mark, because I think of sometimes when family stuff comes up, right? I love my family and
Yes.
I prioritize my family. But there have been times where I've had to sort of set a boundary with them as well to say, I can't help you right now. Give me a day, give me a week, give me some hours to come back to this conversation. But getting comfortable enough to say no was a long journey, but it's
Yes.
been powerful. Simply say, no, I can't do that right now. And if I'm able to have a reason to share that, great. But knowing that if I don't, that's okay. That I can just simply say, no, I can't. And I have to be okay with being able to let that be known so that it is better accepted and acted on. Because otherwise, I know for myself, that can easily latch me into taking on additional things that I may not be ready for at that particular point in time.
So I invite you to think about the student coming right out of undergraduate or graduate school, and they're about to enter this profession where they'll be doing work around trauma, right?
Hmm.
And what advice, recommendations, suggestions that you have for them as to how they can take care of themselves, be successful in this work, while realizing that so many people entering this work really do have the desire to save the world?
Yeah, yeah. I think what I would say, and just coming from my own experience around my journey through this work, is you have to really spend time to know yourself deeply to be able to do this work. Know yourself on a level where you're investing in looking at those places where you haven't wanted to go to for whatever reason, but allowing yourself to be in those spaces and heal as much as you can from that because when you don't, the negative implications it has on yourself, just as a person, but also how you cannot show up for other people when you haven't shown up for yourself.
Wow.
Is a really challenging thing, and that might come right from just doing and having blunders where you're like, "Oh, nope, I didn't know that," and you take a pause and reflect and put that in sort of your knapsack to take with you forward for whatever next experience you might have where that might be useful. But for me, that self awareness is huge. I don't think anyone that is in this type of work, I think anyone who's working with people should have that self awareness. But specifically as a therapist, as a trauma therapist, um, there's a certain nuance and level of self knowledge you have. I would say is critical to have to do this in an effective and impactful way.
Someone once said to me that the triggers we experience working with clients can actually be a gift because they can remind us of work that we still need to do.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you describing it, and we can do that work and grow through that work.
Yes.
Thank you so very much, Marco. I think the wisdom you share is going to help a lot of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
The Checking In podcast is produced by the Great Lakes Mental Health Technology Transfer Center with funding from cooperative agreements with SAMHSA. We encourage you to connect with the Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube to discover many more free products and resources just like this.